Hills and Valleys is a podcast that uncovers stories from leaders in healthcare, tech, and everything in between. Straight from the heart of Silicon Valley, we give you a look at the good, the bad, and the future, one episode at a time. Brought to you by Potrero Medical. Hi everyone, Omar M. Khatib, Director of Growth here at Potrero Medical. Now, many of us wonder what it was like to take the first surgical robotic system, the Vinci system, not only through FDA, but find a place for it in the market and prove out its clinical value. Well, many of you may know this, that Dr. Frederick Mall, who's the co-founder of Intuitive Surgical and also co-founded Auris Health, which was recently acquired by Johnson & Johnson, sits on our board of directors. And fortunately, we were able to get connected with a general surgeon who first trialed the Vinci Surgical System. That was Dr. Barry N. Gardiner. Now, Dr. Gardiner is a general surgeon, still practices here in the Bay Area, and we went out to his office out in the East Bay to catch up with him. He pioneered the introduction and development of laparoscopic surgery back in the early 90s, so he had a natural gift and passion for finding better ways to do surgery and deliver a higher quality of care for patients. Now, Dr. Gardiner served as the principal investigator for the clinical trial of the Da Vinci system back in Mexico City and testified before the FDA panel meeting in 1999, which resulted in the FDA clearing the Da Vinci surgical system for general laparoscopic use. Now, as they say, the rest is history. Now, Dr. Gardiner has vast experience in minimally invasive surgical techniques and continues to use them today, where he continued to serve as an advisor to Dr. Mall at Auris Health. So in this episode, we not only cover the history of those early days at Intuitive Surgical, but also what it takes as a physician and an entrepreneur to develop the right type of technology that really pushes the standard of care and the kind of team and mindset you need to deliver those type of results. So without further ado, enjoy the show. Hey everyone, this is Omar M. Khatib, the Director of Growth over at Potrero Medical, and came out to sunny San Ramon, California to have a very special interview with, I think it's a special interview. I'm pretty excited about this, but with a surgeon who really had the opportunity to get his hands early on some exciting technology that really revolutionized the way surgery is done. So Dr. Barry Gardiner, thank you for joining us.
You bet.
So I guess, great first question to start is, how did you get into medicine? How did it all start for you?
Well, it started when I was in the 6th grade. My dad, I was very close with my father, and he got rheumatic fever. And this was at a time when they were just coming out with the heart-lung machine, and they were starting to do some cardiac surgery for rheumatic heart disease. And I looked at that and I thought, well, that's what I want to do. I think probably in the back of my mind, kind of thinking I would save my father's life, I think. So it was a very pure, very idealistic path that I followed.
And so that got you started into medicine. Now, your father, was he a physician as well, or?
No, he was an amusement park operator.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he was a real Renaissance guy. He was one of the brightest people that I ever had the encounter to run up against, and he could do a little bit of everything.
Interesting.
He was a real Renaissance man. Yeah.
Well, funny enough, you chose general surgery, and especially depending on where you're located, you have to be a bit of a Renaissance man or woman to be a good general surgeon, right?
Well, a little bit, I guess. I when I went to medical school, I was planning on staying the path toward the cardiac surgery. And in medical school, you start to rotate through different services, and I rotated through the cardiac surgery service, and I was treated pretty badly by some pretty arrogant physicians, and I began to look at it and say, do I really want to associate myself with people like that for the rest of my life? And I had just the opposite experience with the general surgeons. They were very receptive, very warm, very education-oriented and supportive. And so I switched midstream.
Interesting. Well, one thing
I seem to find is that it's very often that physicians pick their specialty based on, the people that they get introduced in that specialty.
Oh, I think that's true. I think if you have a positive relationship and a personal relationship with people in that specialty, it tends to you tend to want to gravitate to that field. I think that's pretty common.
So when you were rotating through Gen Surg, what did you see that kind of gave you that aha moment that said, I think I'm home. This is what I need to pursue?
I think it was largely the which we're beginning to lose now in the specialty, but it was the broad cross-section of surgical disease that we would interface with. We could do hysterectomies, you could do nephrectomies, you could operate on the colon or the stomach or the gallbladder, and breast surgery and head and neck surgery. So it was an all-encompassing specialty. At least when I started. It isn't anymore, but when I started, it was that way.
We have all these subspecialties now, picking on the gen surgeons.
Yeah, they are. I mean, general surgery as a specialty is beginning to wither away. We've lost the colon surgery to the colon and rectal guys. We've lost nephrectomies to the urologists. We've lost breast surgery to the female breast surgeons. We've lost head and neck surgery to the ENT people, and I can remember when I was a resident, the flexible colonoscope had just come out, and we were very busy, and we didn't see much utility for a flexible tube that you would put inside the colon. And so we basically gave that up to the gastroenterologists. We'll look at them now.
That gave birth to their whole industry,
right,
pretty much. Yeah.
Right. So, and technology plays into that too, of course, because when the flexible colonoscope was developed, it was purely a diagnostic tool. Well, now, of course, it's therapeutic as well. So things change. Industry and evolution and innovation changes, but it has certainly impacted my specialty, probably from a surgical point of view, as much as any, I think, if not more.
And I don't want to put you on the spot here, but let's say before, and we definitely want to get into the intuitive Da Vinci years, but let's say before the intuitive robot came out, what was the most, I guess, groundbreaking and paradigm shifting technology that came into general surgery?
Prior to intuitive?
Prior to intuitive.
We did open surgery and had been doing open surgery for generations, the same way that generations of surgeons were taught to do that. Probably the thing that was the most impactful was the development of nutritional support with total parenteral nutrition. Absent the technological advances,
sure,
that robotics has introduced, but prior to that, it was really general surgery hadn't changed for generations until the advent of total parenteral nutrition, and we were able to keep people alive and do things for them that therefore we couldn't because they'd starve to death. From a technical point of view, that's probably the biggest impact prior to the advent of electromechanically controlled instruments.
Got it. And so with that innovation, did you're able to keep patients on the bed for a little bit longer? Do you feel like that was a big stepping stone to allow surgeons to start explore laparoscopic surgery?
Probably, actually not. I think the advent of laparoscopic surgery really came about primarily from the gynecologists. They were the first to really use the laparoscope and got the idea that you could put a tube into somebody's abdomen and then inflate the abdomen and you could actually see in there. But they were really only able to do tubal ligations was really what it was pretty much limited to, because you, as a surgeon, had to look through the scope with your eye, holding the camera. Holding the telescope with your hand. That meant you only had one hand to operate with, and nobody else could see anything. You're the only one that could see, and so you really are a one-handed surgeon. And so, if you envision trying to tie your shoe with one hand, you're pretty limited. And that was true with surgery. Laparoscopic surgery had been in existence for a long time, but it was very limited in terms of its applicability, because you couldn't use an assistant and you could only use one hand.
Mm-hmm. So, while you were in residency, you got exposed to a variety of different procedures, as general surgeons did back in, as my dad says, the good old days.
Yeah. I think we all are kind of pine for those days, I think.
It's funny, even new surgical residents now, friends of mine who went into gen surg, they talk about those days. And I'm like, you've only been a resident for a couple of years. They're like, yeah, but we were allowed to do more back then. What were some of the procedures you got most excited about doing when you were a resident?
Oh yeah, in general, when you're a first in training, the bigger the case, the more interesting it was, the more challenging it was, and the more awe-inspiring it was, really. Some of the things that we would do with, take out somebody's rectum and colon, and then look at in the field and recognize, geez, we don't have point A and connect it to point B. How are we going to do that? And taking something that is a threat to the patient, excising it, and then reconstructing the anatomy was probably the fascination that I had with surgery.
And when general surgery, I think from history, it's very much treated like an apprenticeship, and it's very important to have a strong mentor. Who were some of your mentors when you were a surgeon?
Well, they're on the wall back there.
Yeah,
Dr. Blaisdell at UCSF, and Dr. Dunphy, and Dr. Hunt, Dr. Lim.
What were some of the most, valuable lessons that you got? I'm sure there's many, but do you mind sharing a few that kind of influenced your career as a surgeon?
I think the most valuable lesson that I ever had was from Dr. Dunphy. And we used to have a surgical GI conference every Friday up on the 9th floor at UCSF. And he had just come on as the chief of surgery there, and actually I was the first internship class that he had selected. At any rate, we would have this medical surgical GI conference, and it was set up so that all of the attendings were there, and they would sit in the front row, and then the residents would sit behind that, and then the medical students would sit behind that, and they would present challenging cases. And then typically what they would do, they present the case, and then they would go around and ask the most inexperienced people first, and then move to the more experienced, and finally get to the chief about, well, how should you handle this problem? And they presented the chief resident presented this patient with a pancreatic fistula. And he had struggled through multiple operations, and they finally had gotten this down to a fistula from the pancreas. And so they presented this case, and they then brought the patient in. And Dr. Dunphy, just as a mentor, he would always ask the patient, he'd introduce himself and then ask the patient, may I examine you? That made a big impression on me. Asking the patient permission, that's novel. I hadn't been seeing anybody do that. And so he exposed the patient's abdomen, and there was a 4x4 bandage on the patient's abdomen. And so Dr. Dunphy put a pair of gloves on, which also was a good object lesson. He didn't say anything about it, but it was the right thing to do. And so he said, "Man, take this bandage off." And he said, "Yeah, sure." So he took the bandage off and looked at it, and there was a little spot on the bandage, just a little tiny spot. And so he put it back down, and he said, "When was this changed?" And he said, "Oh, last night." He said, "Thank you very much." And this guy had had half a dozen operations and darn near died through some of them. At any rate, they went through and asking all the residents and what they do, and the attendants, and everybody was talking about, well, you need to take his pancreas out, you need to do a Pusto, you need to do a Whipple, you need to do, these extensive, threatening operations. And then finally got to Dr. Dunphy. I'll never forget it. The chief resident, it was actually Dr. Larry Way at the time at UC, he said, "Well, Dr. Dunphy, what would you do?" And he just sat back in his chair and he said, "Lifetime supply of 4x4s. And what that is telling you is not every solution has a not every problem has a surgical solution. And they had gotten this guy down after years and years of suffering to just a little tiny Band-Aid that they had on his abdomen, and you're going to put him through a life-threatening operation just to stop that little bit of drainage? Don't do it. So my takeaway from that was there are times to sheathe your scalpel and not use it. And sometimes the best thing to do is to say no.
I'm sure Sir William Osler would have been very proud at that moment if he heard that.
Yeah.
So, and I think he was the one who said the physician's first duty is to educate the masses not to take medicine.
And the old Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm.
Absolutely.
And at any rate, that's the kind of training that I had.
Wow. Would you say that that's a mark of a good surgeon, which is to exhaust all options before taking a patient to surgery?
Well, I think within reason, sure. I think Dr. Dunphy was known for his surgical judgment, not necessarily his surgical flash and panache as an operating surgeon, but as a real clinician.
And now, after you finished your training, you served as a surgeon in the military, correct?
Yeah.
Do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Well, I came along at the time of the Vietnam War, and I was in residency during the Vietnam War. And there was a program called the Berry Program that if you were selected for that, the military would defer you and not draft you until after you finished training. And then when you finished training, you'd go into the military as a surgeon. So I was selected for the Berry Plan, and so I finished my residency, but then I had a commitment to go into the military after that. And I got stationed at Letterman, which now is shut down. But Letterman was a teaching hospital within the Army system, and that's where I had been stationed. And they put me in charge of their surgical research lab. It was called LAIR, the Letterman Army Institute of Research, and I spent a couple years there basically working on the formation of cholesterol gallstones. I didn't ever fit into the military very well. I never actually got a uniform, complete uniform, much to the chagrin of my commanding officer. I remember one day I was walking from the research institute across to the hospital, and if you had a white coat on, you had what they call cover, and you didn't need to wear your hats and things. Well, I had this hat on You know, it's one of those hats that is pointed in front and pointed in the back, and it says your insignia. I was a major at the time, and I had my hat on, had my white coat on, and I was walking over to the hospital, and I saw this other dude coming up from a different pathway, and we were going to meet. And I could see that he had all sorts of ribbons and stuff on his chest. I didn't know what that was. I just knew that I didn't want to have to salute him. So I sped up and got ahead of him. And I was walking along, and I thought, well, I beat that one. I'm on the way to the hospital, and all of a sudden I hear, "Major!" And I, oh, no. I turned around and said, "Yes, sir." Well, he was a sergeant. And he put his arm around me, and he says, whispered in my ear, he says, "You got your hat on backwards." That was my life in the military.
How long did you serve?
3 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you for your service.
Well, I didn't do anything like what you see these guys doing now. Yeah. Those are people that we ought to thank for their service.
Absolutely. Did you enjoy MASH when it came out, or was that kind of...
A little bit, yeah.
It was a fun show.
A little bit, yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, everybody says I look like Alan Alda. I don't see that, but you know, maybe in my younger days.
I can kind of see that, actually. I mean, of everybody, of all the characters and people in MASH, I mean, you want to look like Hawkeye, right?
Yeah, right.
So you finished your training, you went to the military, and you're out, and you start private practice, and you start your private practice here in California.
Yeah, I started in Oakland.
In Oakland.
Mm-hmm.
Oakland.
Yeah, that's been 30 years ago or 40 years ago now, a long time ago.
And now I'm sure people listening to us, they're eager for this part of the conversation to open up. But what was your practice like, and at what point did you meet Fred Moll? Where did those crossroads hit?
Well, what happened is this was just at the advent of video laparoscopy.
And what year was this? This was like sometime in the mid-90s?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And we had an endemic population in Oakland of patients that had gallstones through the Native American population, and that it is a very common problem that they have. And so I had a huge experience with cholecystectomies, and it the typical cholecystectomy was done through a 6 or 8 inch incision, and the patients would have nasogastric tubes in, and it was a big deal. And as I got more and more experience and more comfort with the operation, I started to shrink the incision down a bit. And one of the assistants that I had one day, she says, I was doing this through a little tiny incision, probably 1.5 inches long. And the assistant said, "God, you're going to be doing these with a laparoscope if you get the incision any smaller than that." Well, right about that time, Eddie Joe Reddick in Nashville, Tennessee, had done the first laparoscopic cholecystectomy. And the thing that facilitated that was the addition of a high-definition color television camera to the telescope. Prior to that, you'd have to look through the scope, and you'd have to hold the scope with one hand, so you only had one hand to operate with, and nobody else could see. When you attach the television camera to that scope, that enabled somebody else to hold the camera so that they could move your field of view to where you needed it. So now you had 2 hands. You could put additional punctures in, put additional instruments in. Now you had 2 hands to work with, and you could bring in an assistant. And that's what really enabled the laparoscopic revolution, was the union of the high-definition color television camera, which they've been using in industry for years, to the laparoscope. And once you did that, that freed us up to be able to really do surgery. we could do more than now just a tubal ligation. And so, of course, we started with the laparoscopic cholecystectomy. So I'd heard about this. I'd heard what Eddie Joe was up to, and I called him. And that was a time he was not so busy that he wouldn't answer. He answered the phone, and he was describing what he was doing, and he said, well, why don't you come on back here, and I'll show you what I'm up to. Well, so I flew back to Nashville and watched Eddie Joe do his third and fourth laparoscopic cholecystectomy. And as a surgeon who was used to open surgery, to see the first videoscopic surgical procedure being done was more than eye-opening. It was revolutionary to me because, you know, I watched him do his first case and then do his second case, and by the time he'd done his second case, the first case had been sent home. And I said, this is going to change the way we do surgery. Mm-hmm. So
that must have given you goosebumps.
Oh, it was an unbelievable. You know, that's one of those experiences in your profession that you will never ever forget. It was a stunning thing. You know, now we take it for granted, but back then, it was to take this gallbladder out through these punctures with a television camera, using a television camera. You ever heard of such a thing?
Yeah.
So, on the way back to the back home, I said, I have got to learn how to do this. So,
did it scare you at all? The idea?
No.
No. You were just excited.
Oh no! You could just see the potential. It was just written all over it. And so I went back to the hospital, and in the basement of our hospital, I had the head nurse get me a camera and a laparoscope, and I started to practice. I'd get cow livers, and I'd put them in the box, and I'd put scopes in this cardboard box, and I'd put my instruments in there, and I'd operate, and I did that enough so that I was then pretty comfortable that I was safe and I knew what I was doing. At that point, we didn't even have a clip applier. You know, now they've got clip appliers that are automatic, will go through the laparoscope. At that point, there wasn't a clip applier that went through a laparoscope, so we had to make one, kind of jerry-rig one. But I did all that, and I was comfortable that I was going to be able to do this. And so I went up to my to the head nurse in the operating room and said, "There's this new operation. I want to do this. They're taking the gallbladder out with the laparoscope." And she says, "Oh, I kind of heard about that. Why don't you just go up and talk to the medical staff office and just be sure that that's okay?" So I went up to the medical staff office and talked to them, and they said, "Well, that sounds okay, but you know, maybe you just ought to talk to the chief of surgery." And so I went and talked to the chief of surgery, and he said, "Well, that sounds okay, but maybe we ought to have a meeting." And by that time, I thought, this isn't going well. And at any rate, so I had the meeting, and I had videos from Eddie Joe, and I told them what I'd done, and that I was all ready to do this. And they said, "Well, this should never be done in a community hospital. It ought to be done in a university hospital, and no, you can't do it." So I thought, so I left that meeting. Okay. So I called Dr. Blaisdell. He's up on the wall there. And I said, "Bill, Barry here." You know, and I told him the story, and he said, "Well, why don't you come up and do it up here? You can work with Dr. Bruce Wolf." And he's up in Sacramento at this point. So I went up, and they put me on staff at University of Davis, UC Davis in Sacramento. And we went into the lab and worked it out, and so Bruce and I were comfortable that we could do this, and so then we started to do cases at UC Davis. In the meantime, I had actually gone to Dr. Way at UCSF and asked him if we could do it there because it would just make so much more sense. It's not 50 miles away, and he was not interested.
And so just, you know, I hate to interrupt, but just I want to recap for the people listening. So you believed in this innovation, you're excited about it, that you went on your own time started practicing and making, boxes with calibers on it just to practice it.
Yeah.
And the fact that you couldn't do it at your hospital motivated you to find a way to drive 50 miles away just to do it.
Yeah.
See, that's incredibly inspiring.
And so what happened is, as I mentioned, I had a very large population of patients who needed their gallbladder out. I knew that this operation was available, and so I told them, I said, if you can hold on for a little bit until we get this set up, we can do it that way instead of this way. And so our first patient was actually one of my patients from Oakland. It's a gorgeous, young woman, and took her up to Sacramento and took her gallbladder out. I remember when the gallbladder came out.
Appreciated that small incision.
She was a beautiful woman, and she did. And I can remember we got the gallbladder out, and there was just a gasp in the operating room, and everybody started to applaud. It was really interesting. But at any rate, so I kept going up to Sacramento, and I would help Dr. Wolf with his cases, and I'd bring my cases up, and we got about 50 cases done, and they all had done very well. And so then I thought, well, I'm going to go back again and see if I can get privileges to do these cases in my hospital. And eventually we did. The doctors weren't happy about it, and they said, well, we want to make the criteria very stiff and rigid to get credentials. And
for who can do those?
Yeah, for who can do them. And so I said, that's fine, make it whatever you want. So they put a set of criteria in that the only person that could meet them was me, because nobody else had, I had already done 50 cases. And so it slowed them down for about a year and a half in terms of actually having anybody else learn how to do that.
Because you're the only one.
Yeah, I was the only one around. And then pretty soon Kaiser came to me and asked me if I would train the Kaiser doctors how to do this surgery. And so they identified 2 surgeons at each of the Northern California Kaiser facilities, and they would bring their patients to my hospital, and I'd teach them how to do the laparoscopic cholecystectomy until they become comfortable and proficient, and then they'd go back and then they would teach the other surgeons in their hospital. So it became kind of a trainer of the trainers, if you will, situation.
Classic surgical apprenticeship, right? Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like that's right around like more or less the late 90s.
Yeah, late
right?
90s. Mm-hmm.
And so you're just getting comfortable, and I'm sure there's still a lot of excitement with this new surgical skill. And then where does surgical robotics all? Because if you got excited about videoscope, right? I can't imagine how you felt when you saw or heard the idea of a robot.
Well, what happened is I was leading out the way I did with the laparoscopic cholecystectomy. That caught the attention of industry. And Ethicon came to me and a number of other surgeons that were doing similar things in their communities and asked if I was interested in working with them to develop equipment. And I did that for a couple of years. Went back to Somerville in New Jersey, and we were working on an anastomotic device for colon surgery. And then Fred Mall heard about me just by word of mouth and invited me to come to a company that he had just founded called Origin Med Systems, and they were developing some balloon technology to enable laparoscopic surgery to be done outside the peritoneal cavity, and hernia repairs primarily. And I worked with Fred on that project for a couple of years. And they finished, and then they sold that company, and so I went back doing my surgery. Mm-hmm. And then one morning, Fred calls me, and he says, "Hey, can we have lunch?" And you never turn Fred Mall down. I mean, you only do that at your peril.
I've heard that many times, and that's actually funny because it's great to hear that in industry, but it's something else to hear from a peer from him. So,
Fred is a remarkable human being, and So he called and said, I've got an idea that I would like to kind of bounce off of you. Well, can we have lunch? So he came up to our hospital and we had lunch, and that was the inception of Intuitive Surgical.
And that happened out here in California, so I got to ask mainly for myself, but also the other industry professionals, because we always talk about the stories of when Intuitive and this whole thing was conceived. What restaurant? Where did this exactly happen? Because I'm sure some of us would like to go and sort of be like, this is the place that it actually happened.
Well, we had lunch at the cafeteria in the hospital. It was no more dramatic than that. But he was describing an idea that he had about electromechanical control of instruments. And there was a company at Stanford Research Institute, or a group, who had developed a robotic surgery system that ultimately morphed into what Intuitive has become.
And that was SRI, right?
And that was SRI, Stanford Research Institute, and it was research that was funded through the Army or through the Defense Department. The idea being that if you had robotic surgery capability, you could scoop up the wounded soldier, bring them into a surgical facility right at the front lines, and have the surgeon in the back line, safe from injury, basically conduct the operation. That was their premise. So Fred asked me to go down and take a look at what they had. Well, I went down, and they had a very primitive but effective telemanipulator, where you could work at a console and you could actually control instruments that worked inside a different cavity. And so I went down and looked at that and called Fred back, and he said, well, what did you think? And I said, well, you should do this. You should do this. I mean, I think it's preliminary and it's rudimentary, and it's going to be a lot of work and a lot of development, but you should do this. And he said, well, that's what I thought too. Fred and I have known each other ever since, and it's very uncommon for Fred and I to basically go different pathways. We almost always see things the same way, and this was no different. And so Fred asked me if I was interested in getting involved. And I said, no, I don't think so.
Well, I thought you said you can't. Fred Mall's somebody you can't refuse.
No, I'm kidding.
Well, okay.
I'm kidding. So that began about a 4 or 5 year involvement with Intuitive. As he had just founded Intuitive with Rob Young.
But it started as Origin and evolved into Intuitive, or Intuitive was its own thing?
No, Origin was... Fred started out as a surgery resident in Seattle, and he had an idea. He went into the lab for a year after a first year of residency, and he thought, there's safer ways of putting trocars into patients' abdomens than the way they're doing it.
Right, yeah.
And he developed the safety-shielded trocar. And he tried to sell that, and actually never went back to finish his surgery residency. Sold that idea to
was it U.S. Surgical?
U.S. Surgical, and then he was free to go on to his next venture. Well, his next venture was Origin Med Systems. That's where I met Fred, and that was developing this balloon technology for doing retroperitoneal surgery. He sold that to Eli Lilly, and then he founded Intuitive. So it's been a litany of companies. He went on from Intuitive to found Hansen Medical, and then he's gone on from Hansen Medical to found Auris Health. So everything he's touched has turned out just exactly the way he had envisioned. With the exception probably of Hansen. Hansen didn't turn out to be as effective or as successful as the other companies, but its other companies have been hugely successful.
Yeah.
And so, at any rate, when he said, do I want to be involved, I said, I'd love to be involved. And so they brought me on as Intuitive's first and probably principal advisor, clinical advisor.
And I saw that, I think it was 200, 270 cases to be done before presenting to the FDA, and you did 50 of those. So you really pioneered this surgical robot and went to lands and bowels that surgeons have not gone to before.
Yeah, I think the thing that what really happened is we worked for a couple of years developing the concept that the SRI had into an actual workable robot. And we actually took that robot. I mean, what we were actually trying to do was to develop a robot to do coronary artery surgery with. It just made business sense for them to go after a high volume, expensive procedure. And so we were trying to go after coronary artery surgery. Well, it turns out that bar is a hard one to jump over. The visualization is difficult. You don't have any safety net underneath you. If something happens, you have a dead patient. And so it was very, very difficult, very challenging. We tried back in Leipzig to get a coronary artery anastomosis done, and we never were able to do it. We took the system to France and did some mitral valve reconstructions with Carpentier, and those went sort of okay. But it was, I can remember after watching Carpentier do his first mitral valve surgery, he came back and held court with all the surgeons, all the company in his amphitheater there, and he walked in and wiped his brow and he said, well, you succeeded in making a very easy operation very difficult. And it was really true. I mean, it really was true. Heart surgery is really a tough thing to get done. And so Intuitive was really hanging by its fingernails in terms of whether it was going to survive or not.
Yeah, I remember hearing about those.
They may not see it that way, but that was really true.
Yeah.
Because we had a product that would work. We had FDA clearance for it. And, the whole concept of Intuitive is to try and immerse the surgeon back into the surgical field and do so in a way that returns to them the capabilities that they lost when they went from open surgery to laparoscopic surgery, namely the wrist. And it was Fred and I who really insisted on having a wrist at the end of the instruments. Mm-hmm. And that enabled Intuitive. Well, we got through the FDA process. We had clearance for this device, but we didn't have any operations that we could do with it.
That's a big problem, right?
Yeah. And Fred called me one night and he said, hey, this is Fred again for you. I've been thinking and looking at this. And he says, what do you think about a prostatectomy? Do you think we could do a prostatectomy with this device?
Where were you and where was he when that phone call happened? 'Cause this is like robotic surgery history.
I don't know where Fred was. I was at home. And, it just makes all the sense in the world because you're operating in a small space. You need to be able to sew, and you need to have your instruments come from back by the television camera and focus down on a small area deep in a hole. Well, that's exactly what prostate surgery is about. You need to do all of those things. And so I said, Fred, it just seems like a tremendously rich field to explore. Why we didn't do that before.
Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating about it, at least from myself and many of my peers who are in surgical robotics, that moment is a classic case where they talk about the value of technology applied to procedure to change the workflow.
There's no question. There's no question about it. it not only changed, most prostatectomies are now done with the robot. So what happened is I said, well, let's do this. I said, the problem is that I don't do prostatectomies, and the prostatectomists don't do laparoscopy. So he and I kind of looked at that and said, well, maybe we could work together. So I contacted the one guy out here who does most of the prostatectomies and told him about this, and I said, "You willing to work with me?" And so he was. So we started, and we did it in a series of stages. We do part of the dissection and then open and finish the operation.
Who was that surgeon that you reached out to?
Jim Carroll.
Jim Carroll
out here. And then eventually we would just do a little bit more of each operation each time we did it. And after about a half a dozen cases, we were able to get through the first one. Got through it successfully, and it just went on from there. So.
And what year was that? When was that? Around 2000, 2001?
Probably 2000, 2001 or two, maybe something like that. Yeah.
And how did it? On one side, and I'm going to speak specifically for general surgeons. I've noticed with general surgeons that they get excited about technology and new techniques and everything, but since what you alluded to earlier, the last few decades, specifically, I think like from the 70s up to the 90s, a lot of other specialties picked procedures off from the general surgeons. So how was the general surgical community? How did the surgical community react when they heard about the robot and the radical prostatectomy?
Pretty negatively.
And I heard about those days.
Yeah,
so tell us a little more about that.
Surgeons tend to be pretty conservative, and you see it still today. They kind of want to do things the way they were trained, and not to step outside their comfort zone and not to reach and stretch and grow. It's just natural history of surgeons to be that way. And the majority of the surgeons still don't use the robot at our hospital. So it was very slow to be adopted. And in fact, the initial business plan for Intuitive was not to sell the razor, but to sell the razor blade.
Right.
They didn't care about selling the capital equipment. They wanted the disposable instruments. The whole idea was we're going to have these disposable instruments. Well, they use them 10 times, and we'll be able to charge for each use. And initially, they didn't really care whether the damn thing was used very much. They would be happy to sell it, and the hospital was happy to sell it and sit it in the corner. I didn't think that they were going to be successful in selling $1 million and a half piece of equipment that didn't get used. But in the early phases, that's what happened. But gradually, slowly, the surgeons began to come around, and they began to see the same thing with robotic surgery that you saw with laparoscopic cholecystectomy, in that if you didn't adopt the laparoscopic cholecystectomy, pretty much you're going to give up your cholecystectomy business. And I think that surgeons are now beginning to recognize the same thing with the robot. If they don't learn how to use the robot and accept it and adopt it, patients will go to surgeons who have.
How much of it was influenced by the market and by patient demand?
Oh, I think well, early on it was all patient demand. Later, as things went on, Intuitive got into the marketing game and started to promote robotic surgery, and they did it initially with the prostatectomy. Then they centered on hysterectomy. And now finally, although we have talked about this a lot with them, I said, we ought to focus on hernias. Incisional hernias they're very common. It's a high volume procedure, and this is an ideal device for it because you're sewing on the underside on the ceiling. And they just were not, they were focused on the prostatectomy and then the hysterectomy. Well, finally now Intuitive has started to market incisional and even inguinal hernia repair. And so now the market is being driven by the company. And they've actually pretty well saturated the market for hysterectomies, and now they've moved into general surgery. And they've had to, because the prostatectomy, while it's a good operation in a lot of cases, I think increasingly people are recognizing that we're doing more of them than probably need to be done, and a lot of people are being treated with radiation therapy now, or just watchful waiting, and so the volume of prostate surgery is going down. Well, that's a death knell for a company like Intuitive, which had based its entire success on the prostatectomy, and so they moved to the hysterectomy. And now they're branching out into other surgeries. And you can use this robot to do pretty much anything. You can do Whipples with it, or pancreatectomies, or hepatectomies. There really is no limit to it. It's just a matter of how skilled you are.
And, so I'm guessing that once you got kind of a taste of that side of medicine, introducing disruptive technology like that really elevates the standard of care, and provides a better treatment, for patients.
That's right.
So I guess you were up for another ride with Red, and you spent some time as well with Oris, correct?
Right. Well, that's where I met Jeff. Actually,
yeah, and for those listening, Jeff is my boss. It's Jeff Alvers, the VP of Products. So Jeff was, I heard, employee not even number one. He was employee 0 because he.
Well, when I was first invited to Intuitive by Fred, the company had 12 people in it. That's where it was. There was Fred, 12 engineers, and me, and we would meet every Friday, and we would talk about what does this piece of equipment need to do? And this is another one of those things I'll never forget, the discussion about the wrist, because Fred and I were absolutely insistent you need a wrist. And, that was, the engineers just rolled their eyes at us, and, but they kept persisting, and we kept persisting, and put a wrist on the end of those instruments, and that's what made Intuitive. Had we not done that, Intuitive would have died, because its major competitor was computer motion.
Educate the listeners on what happened with computer motion.
Yeah, and they had a very kludgy kind of an ability to sort of do a wrist, but they never really were able to execute it, because they were using a platform that had existed primarily as a camera controller. And so they, rather than start out from scratch, they used their existing platform as a vehicle to try and put this wrist on. Well, it never, ever worked, and it's dead now. Intuitive, on the other hand, started out with a blank slate. We could do anything we wanted, and so we built that system up to have the capabilities that we wanted, and we weren't held in place by some pre-existing platform. So Intuitive, I worked with Intuitive for about 5 years, and then left about the same time Fred did. And then Fred called me again. He says,
"Around what year? Where were you? Where was he?"
It's been about 6 or 7 years ago now. I was actually in the office at that time, and he said, "I'm going to do this again." And I said, "What?" And he said, I want to build a state-of-the-art robot. Because I can remember when Fred and I were at Intuitive, we kept looking at what we had and thinking ahead, 3 or 4 years. Well, what about if you could hang it from the ceiling, or maybe do something different? And we were never able to do that. Well, so Fred founded Oris, and we had lunch again. This was a little Mexican restaurant in Orinda, and we were talking about what would a state-of-the-art robot look like? Because Intuitive Surgical was innovative at the time, and they still are. Don't get me
Absolutely.
wrong, but it was built on technology at the time that was probably 10 years old, and it's basically the same system. And Intuitive has the issue of being kind of tied to their platform, just the way computer motion is tied to its platform. Intuitive has got 3,500 robots out there. They can't abandon them. And
it is a remarkable robot.
Oh, there's no question.
It's very good for what it's focused on.
There's no question about it, and it has been beautifully engineered and beautifully built. There's no question about that. But you kind of look at it and say, well, this is 2018. Can we do better? Can we do different? And so Fred and I started to talk about it, and it was his idea again. He says, well, what do you think about putting it on the bed? It's got to be 6 or 7 years ago now. He says, what about putting it on the bed?
And you're thinking the big Da Vinci robot, and you're like, how are we going to make...
Oh, man, maybe you could do that. You'd kind of have to fold it up somehow. And he says, well, yeah, maybe you could. You could put it in the bed, and he says, oh, you mean so like when somebody turns it on, it kind of transforms into a robot? And he said, yeah. And I said, oh, you're talking about building a transformer. And that was Oris. And so we started out at Oris. Fred and I knew exactly what we wanted to build and what needed to be built. Absolutely. And we started and kept running into roadblocks because the engineers would keep telling us, you can't do that. You can't put the robot down there. It won't ever work. And we kept pushing back at them, and they kept pushing back at us, and we went on for about 3 or 4 years that way. And at one point, we then said, okay, before you say it can't be built, let's at least try and see what we come up with. Because I've seen too many times where people will say, oh, look, this is going to be great here, this idea, and then you actually get it in your hands and it just doesn't work or it's not going to be useful. And the same, just the opposite, where, until you really try it, you don't know how well it's going to work. And those bloody engineers came up with the engineering design that turned the mathematics on its head, and it is working.
And I have to say, it's a beautiful robot.
Yeah.
I got to see it in person, and it's quite remarkable.
Yeah.
So 3-4 years just pushing back and forth.
Yeah.
And, there's that saying that, with pressure you can do one of two things. You can either use it to burst pipes or you can make diamonds. And it looks like, you guys definitely made some diamonds.
Well, it's been an amazing story, and it's been an amazing, really an amazing ride. It's like Henry Ford says, people say it can't be done until somebody does it,
Right. And with Oris's robot, was it similar to Intuitive in the sense that you guys started out with one procedure and realized we don't have a business here, or it does not fit here, and then you changed it to what it's being used?
No, it's just the opposite. It's the opposite. What we were doing at Oris is to develop the next state-of-the-art 21st century robot. We certainly are climbing on the shoulders of Intuitive to get there, but it's a robot that has capabilities that have been designed into it not to do a specific procedure, but do every procedure. That's kind of goes to what the engineers have put into it. It's been a tremendous amount of thought that has gone into where we are. And it is to get us to be able to gain access to anywhere in the abdomen and do anything. So it's not... Intuitive, we were after the coronary artery bypass. But at Oris, we're after all of surgery.
And definitely the way the the way the system is set up, the way it moves, the elegance of it, I can definitely see it doing that. The main thing that it, I guess, was commercialized for was for lung biopsies, correct?
Well, actually, that's the Monarch, and that's a flexible platform for bronchoscopy. Now, we can do that with the system that we have, but they've basically taken that procedure and built a cart around that. That's the Monarch system, which has been introduced already. And that was the thing that Fred brought with him from Hansen is flexible endoscopy. And so he's got a lot of experience and capability in being able to move flexible instruments around. And so the Monarch is different than the iPlatform. The iPlatform being primarily a laparoscopic device.
I see. And is that public knowledge, by the way? The iPlatform?
I don't know. I would think it is. I mean, we've been acquired by Johnson & Johnson.
And so for you, I mean, acquisition's always exciting, right? But things change when that happens. So for you, are you still involved with Auris? And
oh yeah.
So I'm wondering what that next phone call is going to be from Fred, because
I don't know. I wouldn't even begin to venture a guess at that. I think that Fred is committed to Auris and to see that it is successful. And
it's a great team to have over
he's
there, too.
got a lot left to do. So I don't think he needs a next project. I think he's got this one.
He's got plenty on his.
Yeah.
And again, want to be mindful of your time, and we'll wrap this up shortly. But just out of curiosity, the one thing that we've noticed in the last few years, we being the medical device and medical technology industry, is that now, you have these large tech giants, Apple, Google, Microsoft, that they're entering highly regulated public sectors like education, transportation, healthcare is a big one, and of course with that there's this advent of big data, artificial intelligence. As a surgeon, I mean, what are your thoughts about that? How do you think the surgical community looks at that? Where's the value in it?
I have no idea, and I don't think they do either. I've never yet had anybody be able to explain to me how they're going to use this big data. Now, that having been said, I would be the first one to acknowledge that sometimes you need to build it and try it. And the whole field of dreams thing. If you build it, they will come. Maybe once this thing gets realized, and that we will find things about it and for its use that we don't right now. It's a little hard for me to envision where this big data story is going. I mean, I know Google is very, very committed to it. That's a big part of what Verb is all about. But I've not yet been able to have anybody really describe to me concretely how that's going to be translated into better patient care.
Yeah, that's an important.
I mean, it may be translatable into less expensive patient care, but I don't see how it's going to get translated into better patient care. Mm-hmm. Now, but I would be the first one to say, that story hadn't been written yet, mm-hmm. And once we understand what big data is, then we may be able to find a use for it.
Mm. Well, I'll ask you this question that I know that a lot of people, at least in the surgical robotics world, wonder. If you had let's say a robot or let's say a smart surgical OR that could monitor your movements as a surgeon, let's say your success rates, just like as if if you watch a pro football or basketball game, you can get stats on a player.
Oh, sure.
On one side, I think surgeons, knowing how competitive they are, they would enjoy that. But on the other side, I don't know if they would enjoy having that kind of like big brother.
No, they'll be scared to death of it. I'll just tell you.
And educate us why.
At least as of right now. Now the face of medicine is changing tremendously. With like our hospital is being bought up by other larger companies.
Nobody's independent anymore.
No,
it's too hard.
Stanford owns part of Valley and Valley Care Hospital, and UCSF owns part of John Muir, and so the idea of going into practice and hanging up your shingle and being available and good and technically skilled is not as important now as it used to be. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you that surgeons are threatened by, I may be saying things I shouldn't hear, but surgeons tend to be threatened by somebody looking over their shoulder and in a critical fashion. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to be told how to do this cholecystectomy. If I want to do this cholecystectomy open, I should be able to do it open, right?
Well, I guess you go through 5-6 years of training getting told what to do.
I don't want somebody telling me that I shouldn't have converted this operation from a laparoscopic procedure to an open procedure because I was there and I know what the difficulties were, or that it takes me twice as long to do this operation as it does Dr. Jones. They're threatened by that, or that I have fewer complications than Dr. Smith does. They're threatened by that, but it's on the way, and so get used to it.
Right, and it just sounds like, I guess one of the things is to, the importance, and again, I mean, we do this in the industry, but it's important to say that you have to spend as much time as possible side by side with physicians developing these technologies versus what I've seen, at least in the past, with companies I fortunately did not work for, showing up and something being there that day and it's like, you have no choice, you got to use this.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think that the input of people that are using the device or potentially could use the device is hugely important, and a company is foolish to not recognize that. Mm-hmm. There are lots of different ways of doing a surgical procedure, and from draping to to closing, and all the steps in between. And so, and it's one of the things that I think that they're doing such a wonderful job of at ORIS 4 is we have given a huge amount of thought to exactly that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, before we end, I got to ask, one final question. We do have a lot of medical students and residents who do listen to this, and I'm sure a lot of pre-medical students at this point. But, in your career as a physician, are there any books that had, an influence on the way you are as a leader, as a physician? Anything that you would recommend to audiences?
No, it's the people that have impacted my life. The Blaisdells and the Dunphys of the world and the Fred Malls of the world. I guess my advice to those that are just starting out is to diversify and don't shut off avenues that hold promise for you, because making a living now of just doing piecework in surgery is going to be increasingly difficult. And so keep your options open. And that's basically what has led my career in the path that it went. I spend as much time with Fred now and with his company as I do in my practice. And had I not taken that phone call from Dr. Mall 25 years ago, that whole avenue would have been shut down to me. And so keep your options open.
And I think so a lot of my classmates they're just getting out of residency, and so they're kind of lifting their head up to see the world. And I think there's this exciting opportunity that a lot of young physicians don't know about, which is to look for those opportunities to advise, partner, get involved with technology, and have a hand in developing it.
And it takes time to do that. You need to develop the relationships. They need to be trusted. You need to be honest and upfront, and keep confidences. And if you do that, eventually these opportunities will gravitate to you. But if you don't, they'll be shut off. And so that would be my advice. Don't limit yourself to doing piecework, would be my advice to anybody coming out of residency now.
All right. Well, Dr. Gardiner, hey, we really appreciate you taking time out of your practice to sit down and chat with us and share a bit of the story, because I'm telling you, there's a lot of people who are like, somebody should record this or write it down or something. And Jeff said, you want to go talk to Dr. Gardiner? I said, absolutely. So we really appreciate it.
I gave a lecture in Taiwan a couple years ago, and it was an hour lecture, and it was a seminar. And one of the participants in the seminar listened to the story that I was telling about Intuitive and the founding of Intuitive and what happened. And he came up to me and says, "You need to write a book." And I said, "Well, I'll write it for you." So Fred and I have never done that, but I've told Fred that before. He needs to sit down with somebody that can write his story, because it's an amazing American success story. Really
no, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
I call him the Steve Jobs of the medical device industry, and I think
I don't think that's too far off.
Accurate description of what he's done.
He's a lot nicer, though, I think.
That's for sure. No. Fred is not only nice; he's a very loyal person too.
No, absolutely. And I've been, at least fortunate enough for me, the last two companies I've been with, they've been companies Fred companies, or he's been on the board, and so I've been very fortunate to work with them. And actually, I'll have something to share with you. When I first left medical school, I loved medicine, but medical school, being a physician, I just figured out wasn't for me. And I had a father who's a surgeon, and decided, he's very supportive of it.
Yeah, right.
And I remember that time I was very scared. I didn't, we didn't have LinkedIn or Facebook. We did have Facebook, but I didn't know what I was going to do. And I remember my father and some of his friends saying, "Don't worry, you'll be okay." There's actually a couple of surgeons who either left med school or they left residency, and they're involved in technology, and you should look into med device. And so, I appreciate Fred and surgeons like you as well, who've not only pioneered an industry for us, but really led by example and opened everybody's eyes to the idea of trying new technology, doing something new and innovative to push the envelope and do things better.
That's what it's all about.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, you betcha.
All right.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into this episode of Hills and Valleys. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button on our podcast. That way you're notified of new episodes as they're released. And if you're not already, please go ahead and follow Potrero Medical on all our social platforms: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And we'll see you next time.